"Stop gambling, Mom." But my lucky numbers paid for his college tuition. I used to believe that if you sacrificed enough, love would eventually find its way back to you. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I'd share. And if you, for even a second, feel like this sounds familiar, I just ask that you leave a like and subscribe, because this story might help someone draw closer to God's love. Amen. My name is Margaret, and at 73, I thought I knew what disappointment looked like. I thought I understood what it meant to be forgotten, dismissed, treated like an old piece of furniture that no one quite knew what to do with, but couldn't bring themselves to throw away. But sitting in my daughter Lauren's kitchen that Tuesday morning, watching the steam rise from my coffee cup while she spoke to me like I was a stranger who'd overstayed their welcome, I realized I'd only been scratching the surface of heartbreak. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains I'd sewn myself, the same ones Lauren had rolled her eyes at when I'd suggested them, saying they were too old-fashioned for her modern kitchen. But she'd kept them anyway, probably because they were free, like everything else I'd given her over the past 3 years. My fingers traced the rim of my favorite mug, the one with "World's Best Mom" painted in fading letters that Noah had given me for Mother's Day when he was 8. Back when he still ran to hug my legs and tell me about his dreams. "Mom, we need to talk," Lauren said, not looking up from her phone as she scrolled through what I assumed were work emails or social media posts about lives more interesting than the one unfolding in her kitchen. Her voice carried that particular tone I'd grown to recognize, the one that meant I'd done something wrong again, though I could never quite figure out what. I set down my coffee and folded my hands in my lap, a gesture I'd learned in childhood when Sister Mary Catherine would lecture our Sunday school class about patience and humility. "What is it, sweetheart?" I asked, though my heart was already sinking toward my stomach like a stone dropped into deep water. She finally looked at me, and I saw something in her eyes that made my chest tighten. Not anger exactly, but a kind of weary frustration that suggested she'd been building up to this conversation for weeks. "It's about the lottery tickets," she said, and I felt my face flush with the shame of being caught at something I didn't even realize was shameful. Every Wednesday, after my morning prayers and before Lauren woke up for work, I would walk the 6 blocks to Murphy's Corner store. The same route I'd walked for the past 3 years, past the house where Mrs. Henderson used to wave from her garden before she passed last spring, past the small Catholic church where I attended early morning mass when my arthritis wasn't too bad. The lottery tickets weren't about winning. Not really. They were about the 15 minutes of hope I allowed myself each week, the small prayer I whispered as I chose my numbers, the same numbers I'd been playing for 20 years, 4 to 7, 18, 22, 31, 42, Noah's birthday, Lauren's birthday, my wedding anniversary, the day my husband Thomas passed, the day Lauren graduated college, and the number of years Thomas and I were married before God called him home. "I don't understand what you mean," I said, though we both knew I understood perfectly. Lauren sighed and pulled out her phone, scrolling until she found whatever evidence she'd been collecting. "Mom, I've been keeping track. You spend $40 a week on those tickets. That's over $2,000 a year. Money you don't have. Money we can't afford for you to waste." The word "waste" hit me like a physical blow. I thought about the years I'd worked double shifts at the diner to help pay for Lauren's college, the way I'd sold my mother's wedding ring to cover her security deposit when she moved to Chicago for her first job, the careful budgeting that had allowed me to give her everything she needed while asking for nothing in return. $40 a week seemed like such a small thing compared to the $40,000 I'd given her when her marriage fell apart, and she needed help keeping her house. "It's not about the money," I said quietly, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew she wouldn't understand. How could I explain that those lottery tickets were my only connection to possibility? That in a life that had become small and predictable and lonely, they represented the one thing that was still mine to hope for? "Then what is it about?" Lauren asked, and there was genuine confusion in her voice, as if she couldn't comprehend why her 73-year-old mother might need something to look forward to. I looked around the kitchen where I'd spent the last 3 years of my life, cooking meals that were eaten without thanks, cleaning messes that were made without consideration, existing in the spaces between other people's more important lives. The walls were decorated with photos of Noah's soccer games and school plays, Lauren's work achievements and vacation trips, a visual timeline of a family I was part of but somehow not included in. There were no photos of me, no acknowledgement of the sacrifices that had made their comfortable life possible. "It's about hope," I said finally, and my voice cracked on the word because it sounded so foolish when spoken aloud. "It's about believing that maybe someday things might be different." Lauren's expression softened slightly, but not enough to chase away the disappointment in her eyes. "Mom, you're 73 years old. What do you need to change? You have a home here. You have family. You have everything you need. This gambling thing, it's not healthy. It's not what Dad would have wanted." The mention of Thomas felt like salt in an open wound. Thomas, who had loved me completely and without condition, who had made me feel valuable and necessary and seen. Thomas, who had been gone for 15 years but whose absence still felt fresh every morning when I woke up alone in the small bedroom Lauren had allocated for me, the one that used to be her office before I became another household responsibility to manage. "Don't you dare tell me what your father would have wanted," I said, and there was steel in my voice that surprised us both. "He would have wanted me to be happy. He would have wanted me to feel like I mattered. He would have wanted—" I stopped myself before I said too much, before I admitted that Thomas would have wanted his wife to feel loved in her old age instead of tolerated like an inconvenience. But the words hung in the air anyway, unspoken but understood. Lauren's phone buzzed with a text message, and she glanced at it with the automatic reflex of someone whose attention was always divided among multiple priorities. "Look, Mom, I'm not trying to hurt your feelings. I'm trying to help you. Mrs. Patterson from down the street mentioned she saw you buying tickets again, and people are starting to talk. They think you have a gambling problem. People are starting to talk." The phrase echoed in my mind like a cruel song. In all my years of attending Mass, volunteering at church functions, helping neighbors with their groceries when they were sick, being the kind of person who remembered birthdays and sent sympathy cards and never missed a Sunday service, what people would remember about me was that I bought lottery tickets. "What people?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "It doesn't matter who," Lauren said, standing up and moving toward the coffee maker for a refill. "What matters is that this behavior isn't normal for someone your age. Maybe we should look into some kind of counseling or support groups for people with addictions." Addictions. The word landed between us like a slap, harsh and final and devastating in its implication. In Lauren's mind, I had already been transformed from her mother into a problem to be solved, a condition to be managed, a source of embarrassment that needed to be addressed before it reflected poorly on her standing in the community. I stood up slowly, my arthritis making the movement more difficult than it should have been, and carried my mug to the sink. The world's best mom faced away from me as I rinsed it, and I found myself staring at the blank white ceramic, wondering when I had stopped being the person worthy of that title and become someone whose small pleasures were considered pathological. That afternoon, while Lauren was at work and Noah was at school, I sat in my room with my Bible open to Psalms, searching for comfort in words that had sustained me through previous dark periods. "Wait for the Lord. Be strong and take heart and wait for the Lord," I read aloud, though my voice sounded hollow in the empty room. I pulled out the small wooden box where I kept my lottery tickets. Not the winning ones, because there had never been any, but the losing ones that I saved like pressed flowers or old love letters, evidence of hope that had been offered and declined but not entirely abandoned. $40 a week for 20 years. Lauren was right about the mathematics, even if she was wrong about everything else. But as I sat there counting the accumulated dreams of 2 decades, I realized something that made my heart beat faster with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Tonight was Wednesday. Tonight, the numbers would be drawn again, and for the first time in years, instead of whispering my usual prayer for small blessings and peaceful days, I found myself asking God for something bigger. I asked Him to prove that hope wasn't foolish. I asked Him to show me that I still mattered. I asked Him to give me one reason to believe that the woman who had sacrificed everything for the people she loved most might finally be worthy of something good in return. As the sun set outside my window, casting long shadows across the room where I'd learned to make myself invisible, I tucked my Bible under my arm and prepared to walk to Murphy's Corner store one more time. Not because I was addicted to gambling, but because sometimes faith requires you to put your trust in the impossible. And sometimes, when you've been dismissed and diminished and told you're a burden for long enough, the only prayer left is the desperate hope that God still remembers your name. Walking to Murphy's Corner store that evening, my mind drifted back to the first time Lauren had asked for help. She was 26 then, fresh out of her master's program and drowning in student loans that seemed to multiply like weeds in an untended garden. I remember the way she sat at my kitchen table. My old kitchen table, in the house I'd owned free and clear, with tears streaming down her face as she calculated numbers that never seemed to add up to hope. "Mom, I don't know what to do," she'd sobbed, her voice breaking like it used to when she was 7 and had scraped her knee. "The payments are more than my rent. I can't keep up. I'm going to lose everything." I had looked at my daughter, this beautiful, intelligent woman I'd raised alone after Thomas passed, and I didn't hesitate. I withdrew $15,000 from my retirement account, money I'd saved by eating bologna sandwiches for lunch and driving my old Buick until the mechanic told me it was held together by prayer and stubbornness. The penalty fees alone cost me nearly $2,000. But what mother counts the cost when her child is drowning? "There," I'd said, sliding the check across the table. "This will give you breathing room." Lauren had hugged me then, really hugged me, and whispered, "Thank you," into my hair like she used to when she was small, and I'd bandaged her scraped knees or read her bedtime stories about princesses who saved themselves. For a moment, I felt necessary again, valued, like the woman who had worked double shifts at Murphy's Diner for 18 years to make sure Lauren could go to college without debt, the debt she'd accumulated anyway in graduate school. But gratitude, I learned, has an expiration date shorter than milk left in the sun. The thank yous became assumptions. The "I don't know how to repay you" became, "Could you help me with just one more thing?" When Lauren met Robert, I covered the cost of her wedding dress because she wanted something special and her budget was tight. When they bought their first house, I helped with the down payment because young couples deserve a good start. When Noah was born and daycare costs exceeded what they'd planned, I moved in temporarily to help with babysitting. Temporarily stretched into 3 years and counting. I stopped walking for a moment, leaning against the familiar oak tree that marked the halfway point to Murphy's. This tree had sheltered me through countless evening walks, its branches reaching toward heaven like the arms I raised in prayer each morning and night. Pressing my palm against its rough bark, I closed my eyes and remembered the day Lauren's marriage began to crumble. I had been folding Noah's laundry in the living room when I heard the shouting from upstairs. Angry voices, doors slamming, the sound of objects being thrown against walls. Noah, then 8 years old, had crept downstairs and climbed into my lap without saying a word, his small body trembling as his parents' marriage disintegrated above our heads. "Grandma," he'd whispered, "are they getting divorced like Tommy's parents?" I had held him closer, stroking his dark hair while my heart broke for this innocent child caught in the crossfire of adult failures. "I don't know, sweetheart," I'd answered honestly. "But whatever happens, you're loved. You're so, so loved." The divorce had been swift and brutal. Robert, who'd always treated me with polite distance, became a stranger overnight. He fought for half of everything except responsibility, taking assets while leaving debts, and of course leaving Noah's daily care to Lauren and by extension to me. When Lauren couldn't afford the house payments alone, I didn't hesitate. I sold everything. The house Thomas and I had bought in 1978, where we'd planned to grow old together on the front porch swing he'd built with his own hands. The furniture we'd chosen piece by piece during 42 years of marriage. The china cabinet my mother had given me, filled with dishes that had served Christmas dinners and birthday cakes and ordinary Tuesday night meals that had tasted like love. Even Thomas's tools, carefully maintained in the garage workshop where he'd built Noah's first tricycle and repaired neighbors' broken fixtures without ever accepting payment. All of it gone so Lauren could keep her house, her stability, her pride intact. "Mom, I'll pay you back," she'd promised. And I'd believed her because what choice did I have? What mother doesn't believe her child when they're standing in the wreckage of their life, asking for one more chance to make things right? But 3 years later, there had been no mention of repayment, no acknowledgement that I'd traded my independence for her security. No recognition that I'd moved from being a beloved mother to being live-in help who happened to share her DNA. The evening prayers had become my refuge during those years. Each night, after Lauren and Noah were asleep, I would kneel beside my narrow bed in what used to be the office and open my heart to God. Sometimes I prayed for patience, sometimes for understanding. Often, I prayed for the strength to keep loving without resentment, to keep giving without keeping score, to trust that my sacrifices were part of some larger plan I couldn't see. Dear Jesus, I would whisper into the darkness, help me be the mother Lauren needs, even when she can't see what she needs. Help me be the grandmother Noah deserves, even when I feel invisible. Help me find purpose in this season of my life, even when I feel forgotten. But lately, those prayers had become harder to maintain. Lately, I found myself questioning whether God heard the pleas of used-up old women who'd given everything and still somehow weren't enough. I resumed walking. Murphy's Corner store, now visible in the distance with its familiar neon sign flickering open 24 hours, in red letters that cast an encouraging glow across the empty street. Mr. Murphy himself was usually behind the counter in the evenings, a kind man in his 60s who always asked about my day and meant it when he said it. The memories kept coming as I walked, each one a small wound that had healed improperly, leaving scars I tried to hide from myself. There was the time Lauren had gotten sick with pneumonia, and I'd spent 2 weeks nursing her back to health, sleeping in a chair beside her bed, making homemade soup, and monitoring her fever like she was still my little girl. When she recovered, her first words weren't "thank you," but "I missed so much work. I hope this doesn't affect my promotion." There was Noah's 10th birthday party, where I'd spent 3 days baking and decorating, transforming Lauren's backyard into a superhero wonderland, complete with handmade costumes and games I'd researched online. Lauren had taken credit for the planning when other parents complimented the party, introducing me to newcomers as "my mom who helps out," rather than "the woman who made all this possible." There was the evening Lauren had come home excited about a work conference in San Francisco, her first business trip in years. "Mom, can you watch Noah for the weekend? It's such a great opportunity for networking." Of course I'd said yes. I always said yes. But when she returned with photos of dinners at expensive restaurants and shopping trips down Pier 39, I realized she'd extended a business trip into a personal vacation, using my free babysitting to fund her leisure time. Each memory was a drop of water that had seemed harmless in isolation, but had somehow accumulated into an ocean of resentment I didn't know how to cross. The lottery tickets had started as Thomas's idea, actually. During the last year of his life, when the chemotherapy made him too weak to work, but too stubborn to completely give up hope, he'd begun playing our family numbers every week. "Maggie?" he'd say with the crooked smile that had first made me fall in love with him at 19. "If we win, we'll travel to Ireland like we always planned. If we don't win, well, at least we spent a few minutes believing it was possible." After he passed, I continued the tradition not because I expected to win, but because it felt like keeping a promise to him. Those numbers represented our life together. Birthdays, anniversaries, the date Noah was born, the day Thomas proposed on the steps of St. Mary's Cathedral. Playing them each week was my way of honoring our story, of insisting that our love had mattered enough to be remembered. But Lauren saw only the money spent, not the memories honored. Murphy's door chimed as I entered, and Mr. Murphy looked up from his newspaper with a genuine smile. "Evening, Mrs. Morrison. How are you tonight?" "I'm well, thank you for asking," I replied, though we both knew it was only half true. "Just picking up my usual." He reached for the lottery form without being asked, and I appreciated his discretion. No questions about whether I was sure. No lectures about odds or responsible gambling. Just quiet respect for a woman's choices, even when those choices seemed foolish to everyone else. As I filled in my numbers, the same numbers I'd played for 20 years, I found myself praying differently than usual. Instead of asking for patience or strength or the grace to keep giving, I found myself asking for vindication, for proof that the hope I'd been nurturing wasn't misplaced, for evidence that sometimes the people who give everything deserve to receive something in return. "Same numbers again?" Mr. Murphy asked gently as I handed him the form. "Always the same," I confirmed. "They're family numbers. They mean something." He nodded with understanding. Family numbers are the best kind. They're about more than money, aren't they? I smiled, grateful for his insight. Yes. They're about believing that love leaves marks on the world, even when the people we love forget to notice. Walking home under the streetlights, I clutched my purse where the lottery ticket rested next to my rosary beads and the small prayer book Thomas had given me on our wedding day. Tomorrow night, those numbers would either be chosen or forgotten again, like so many prayers that seem to disappear into silence. But tonight, for the first time in months, I felt something that resembled peace. Not because I expected to win, but because I'd remembered something important. Faith wasn't about guaranteeing outcomes. It was about continuing to hope when hope seemed foolish. It was about trusting that God saw the sacrifices no one else bothered to count. And maybe, just maybe, it was about believing that a woman who'd spent her whole life making other people's dreams possible might finally deserve to have a dream of her own come true. The lottery ticket felt like a small flame of hope in my purse as I walked home that Wednesday evening, but by Thursday morning, that warmth had been extinguished by the familiar chill of being invisible in my own daughter's house. I woke before sunrise, as I always did, and padded quietly to the kitchen to start the coffee. It was my small ritual of usefulness, ensuring that Lauren would have fresh coffee waiting when she stumbled downstairs for work. But instead of finding an empty kitchen, I discovered Noah standing at the counter, 11 years old and making his own breakfast with the mechanical precision of a child who'd learned not to rely on adults for basic care. "Good morning, sweetheart," I whispered, not wanting to wake Lauren. "Let Grandma make you something proper for breakfast." Noah looked up with those serious brown eyes that reminded me so much of Thomas. "Mom says I'm old enough to handle my own morning routine. She doesn't want me bothering you anymore." Bothering me. The words hit like a physical blow to my chest. When had caring for my grandson become a bother? When had the joy of buttering his toast and listening to his chatter about school projects become something I needed to be protected from? "You could never bother me," I said softly. But Noah was already heading upstairs with his bowl of cereal, following the new rules that kept him at arm's length from his grandmother's affection. Lauren appeared an hour later, dressed for work, and scrolling through her phone with the absorption of someone whose real life existed somewhere beyond the kitchen where I stood washing dishes that weren't mine in a house I'd helped save, but didn't belong in. "Morning, Mom," she said without looking up. "I need you to pick up my dry cleaning today. The pink slip is on the counter. And can you stop by the pharmacy? Noah's out of his allergy medication." "No, please. No thank you in advance." Just a list of tasks delivered with the assumption that my time belonged to her. That my day existed solely to manage the errands she couldn't fit into her schedule. "Of course," I said, because what else could I say? "Will you be home for dinner? I was thinking of making that pot roast you used to love." "I'm having dinner with clients," she replied, finally looking up from her phone. "And, Mom, could you try to keep the cooking smells down? I've been getting complaints from neighbors about the smell of onions and garlic. Mrs. Patterson mentioned it yesterday." Mrs. Patterson. The same neighbor who'd apparently been monitoring my lottery ticket purchases. I wondered what other aspects of my quiet existence were being discussed and judged by people who'd never bothered to introduce themselves properly or ask how I was adjusting to my new life. "I'll be more careful," I murmured, though the words tasted like betrayal. Thomas had always said my cooking was one of my greatest gifts, that I could make a feast from leftovers and love. Now, even that small pleasure was something to be managed and controlled. The dry cleaner's shop sat next to a small Catholic church I'd never entered, though I'd passed it dozens of times during my errands. After collecting Lauren's suits and Noah's school uniforms, I found myself standing outside St. Anthony's, reading the small sign that announced daily mass at noon. It was 11:45. I hadn't been to weekday mass in months. Lauren's schedule had somehow consumed my mornings, and by evening, I was too exhausted from a day of small humiliations to seek the comfort of community worship. But standing there with my arms full of other people's clothing, I felt a desperate need for sanctuary. The church was nearly empty, just a handful of elderly parishioners scattered among pews that could hold hundreds. I slipped into a back row, setting Lauren's dry cleaning carefully beside me like I was babysitting someone else's responsibilities, even in the house of God. Father Miguel, A young priest with kind eyes and an accent that suggested he understood what it meant to be far from home, spoke about the widow's mite during his brief homily. "She gave all she had," he said, his voice echoing gently in the sparse congregation, "not from her abundance, but from her poverty. And Jesus saw her when no one else did." I closed my eyes and felt tears I hadn't known were waiting. Jesus saw her when no one else did. When was the last time someone had really seen me? Not as a babysitter or housekeeper or errand runner, but as Margaret Morrison, a woman with her own thoughts and feelings and needs that mattered. After Mass, I lit a candle for Thomas, dropping my last $2 into the donation box. As the flame flickered to life, I whispered a prayer that felt different from my usual requests for patience and strength. "Jesus," I said quietly, "I'm tired of being invisible. I'm tired of giving everything and having it treated like nothing. If you can see me, if you remember my name, please help me find a way to matter again." The afternoon brought a phone call that shattered what remained of my fragile composure. Lauren's voice was sharp with irritation when she called from work. "Mom, Noah's teacher wants to schedule a parent conference about his grades, but I can't take time off work right now. Can you handle it?" "Of course," I said automatically. "What's wrong with his grades?" "His math scores have dropped, and apparently he's been distracted in class. Mrs. Henderson thinks he might benefit from tutoring. But honestly, I think he's just being lazy. Maybe you could talk to him about applying himself better." Lazy. She'd called her own son lazy for struggling with mathematics, the same way she'd called my lottery tickets pathetic and sad. It seemed Lauren had developed a talent for reducing complex human struggles to simple character flaws that could be solved with criticism rather than compassion. I met with Mrs. Henderson the next day, sitting in a classroom chair designed for someone much smaller, while Noah's teacher explained that my grandson was emotionally withdrawn and seemed to carry adult worries inappropriate for his age. "He's mentioned that his grandmother lives with them now," Mrs. Henderson said gently. "Sometimes children his age worry about family stability, especially after a divorce. Has there been any discussion about counseling or family therapy?" Family therapy. I almost laughed, but it would have come out as a sob. When would we fit family therapy into Lauren's schedule? Between her client dinners and my errands and the careful choreography we'd developed to avoid honest conversations about anything that mattered. "I'll discuss it with his mother," I said, though I already knew Lauren would dismiss the suggestion as unnecessary drama. That evening I tried to talk to Lauren about the teacher's concerns, catching her between phone calls and emails in her home office. "Mrs. Henderson thinks Noah might benefit from counseling," I began carefully. "She's concerned about his emotional state." Lauren sighed without looking up from her computer. "He's fine, Mom. He's just adjusting to having you around all the time. Kids need space to be independent. Having me around all the time. As if my presence was the problem rather than the solution to Noah's need for stability and attention. As if the grandmother who remembered his favorite bedtime stories and helped with homework and made sure he had clean clothes for school was somehow damaging his development. "Maybe if we spent more time together as a family," I started. "We're not a traditional family anymore," Lauren cut me off. "We're figuring things out as we go. And honestly, Mom, I think you're projecting your own issues onto Noah. Just because you're having trouble adjusting doesn't mean he is. Projecting my own issues." The phrase followed me to my room that night, where I knelt beside my bed with my rosary and tried to pray through the growing certainty that I was losing my faith along with everything else. "Hail Mary, full of grace," I whispered, but the words felt empty, mechanical. "The Lord is with thee." But was he? Was God with me in this small room where I existed at the margins of my daughter's life? Was Christ present in the endless series of small cruelties that were slowly erasing my sense of self? Was the Holy Spirit moving through conversations where my concerns were dismissed and my feelings were pathologized? I pulled out my small mirror, the one I'd carried in my purse for 40 years, and looked at my reflection in the lamplight. 73 years old, with gray hair that needed cutting and lines around my eyes that spoke of decades of worry and sacrifice. When had I become this woman? When had I transformed from Margaret Morrison, beloved wife and devoted mother, into this ghostly figure who apologized for taking up space? The lottery ticket was tucked inside my prayer book, and I held it up to the light like it was a sacred relic. These numbers represented the last thing that was truly mine. My hope, my choice, my small rebellion against a world that had decided I was finished contributing anything of value. Am I being tested, or just forgotten? I whispered to the empty room, my voice barely audible even to myself. The question hung in the silence like incense, rising toward heaven with all the other prayers of desperate women who'd given everything and found themselves with nothing left to give. Outside my window, the suburban neighborhood settled into another peaceful evening, families gathering around dinner tables and television sets, children being tucked into beds by parents who still saw them as precious rather than burdensome. I pressed the lottery ticket against my heart and made a decision that felt both reckless and necessary. Tomorrow night, when those numbers were drawn, I would either be vindicated in my foolish hope or forced to face the reality that God had stopped listening to the prayers of used-up old women who'd mistaken sacrifice for love. But tonight, I would hold on to my small flame of possibility and trust that somewhere in the darkness, someone still remembered that Margaret Morrison had once been a woman worth saving. Friday arrived with the weight of accumulated grief, and I woke to the sound of Lauren's voice drifting up from the kitchen, not speaking to Noah, but on the phone with her sister Rebecca in Portland. Rebecca, who visited twice a year and called every few months, always managing to time her contact perfectly to avoid any real responsibility for our family's struggles. "I'm telling you, Becca, I'm worried about her," Lauren was saying, her voice carrying the theatrical concern she used when discussing problems she wanted others to solve. "She's becoming obsessed with these lottery tickets. Mrs. Patterson says she sees her walking to that corner store every week, sometimes twice. And yesterday she spent 2 hours at some random church instead of coming straight home from errands." I pressed my ear closer to the door, my heart pounding with the shameful desperation of someone eavesdropping on their own character assassination. "No, I haven't talked to her about it directly," Lauren continued. "What am I supposed to say? Mom, you're acting crazy. She gets so defensive about everything lately. Yesterday I mentioned that the neighbors complained about cooking smells, and she looked at me like I'd slapped her. Cooking smells. The pot roast I'd made with love, using a recipe Thomas had praised for 30 years, had been reduced to a neighborhood nuisance that needed management. I touched the cross pendant at my throat, the one Thomas had given me for our 10th anniversary, and felt something inside my chest crack like ice under pressure. "Maybe she needs to see someone." Rebecca's voice came through the phone speaker, tinny and distant. "A therapist or something. Gambling addiction is a real thing, Lauren. And at her age, with Dad gone so long, maybe she's having some kind of breakdown. Breakdown, gambling addiction, the clinical terms for my pain, my hope, my desperate attempt to maintain some small corner of possibility in a life that had become a series of managed disappointments." I crept back to my room and sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the lottery ticket I'd placed on my nightstand like a prayer card. In 12 hours, those numbers would either validate my faith or confirm my foolishness. But listening to my daughters discuss my mental health like I was an unstable stranger they'd been burdened with caring for, I realized the outcome might not matter as much as I'd thought. The confrontation came that evening, perfectly orchestrated for maximum psychological impact. Lauren had picked up Noah from soccer practice and called him into the living room where I sat reading my Bible, trying to find comfort in verses about God's faithfulness to those who wait upon him. "Noah, sit down," Lauren said, positioning herself between my grandson and me like a shield. "We need to have a family conversation about Grandma." Noah's face immediately clouded with worry, those serious brown eyes darting between his mother and me with the hypervigilance of a child who'd learned to read adult moods for signs of impending catastrophe. "What's wrong with Grandma?" he asked, and I heard genuine fear in his voice that made my heart fracture completely. "Nothing's wrong with me, sweetheart," I said quickly, but Lauren held up her hand to silence me. "Actually, Mom, we need to be honest here," she said, settling into her parenting voice, the one she used when delivering uncomfortable truths wrapped in false compassion. "Noah, Grandma has been making some choices lately that have us concerned. She's been spending money on lottery tickets every week, and that's not really healthy behavior for someone her age." I watched my grandson's face crumple with confusion and embarrassment. At 11, He was old enough to understand that gambling was considered shameful, but too young to comprehend the complexity of adult desperation that might drive someone to seek hope in unlikely places. "Are you sick, Grandma?" he whispered, and the innocent question shattered something fundamental inside me. "No, baby," I said, reaching for his hand, but Lauren intercepted the gesture. "The thing is, Noah," Lauren continued relentlessly, "when people get older, sometimes they make decisions that don't make sense to the rest of us. And when you live with someone who's making those kinds of decisions, it affects the whole family. The whole family. As if my weekly lottery tickets were somehow damaging Noah's development or threatening Lauren's carefully constructed suburban stability. As if the woman who'd sacrificed her retirement savings to keep their house out of foreclosure was now endangering their well-being with $40 a week spent on hope. "I think you owe Noah an explanation," Lauren said, turning to me with the righteous authority of someone who'd appointed herself the family's moral guardian. "Tell him why you think gambling is more important than setting a good example." The words hung in the air like a trap designed to catch me no matter how I responded. If I defended my lottery tickets, I'd be choosing gambling over my grandson's welfare. If I apologized, I'd be admitting that my last small pleasure was indeed shameful and pathological. Noah was crying now, quiet tears that he tried to hide by looking down at his hands. This beautiful boy who'd never asked for any of the adult dysfunction that surrounded him, who'd already endured his parents' divorce and his father's abandonment, was now being forced to carry the weight of his grandmother's alleged moral failings. "Lauren," I said quietly, my voice steadier than I felt, "this isn't a conversation we should be having in front of Noah." "Why not?" she demanded. "He lives here too. He deserves to understand why his grandmother chooses to waste money instead of contributing meaningfully to this household." Contributing meaningfully. The phrase was a masterpiece of cruelty, suggesting that 3 years of cooking, cleaning, babysitting, and emotional support had been somehow inadequate compared to the financial contribution she expected from someone who'd already given her everything. "What exactly would you like me to contribute?" I asked. And for the first time in months, there was steel in my voice. "I sold my house so you could keep yours. I gave you my life savings so you could pay off your divorce lawyer. I take care of Noah when you're working late. I do your errands, your cleaning, your cooking. What meaningful contribution am I failing to make?" Lauren's face flushed with the anger of someone who'd been caught in their own logic. "That's not what I meant, and you know it. I'm talking about your attitude. Your martyrdom complex. Acting like you've sacrificed so much when we've given you a home and a purpose. A purpose. As if my existence was only valid insofar as it served her needs. As if the woman who'd raised her alone after Thomas died, who'd worked double shifts to pay for her education, who'd loved her unconditionally through every mistake and failure, was now valuable only as unpaid household help. And furthermore," Lauren continued, gaining momentum, "I've been patient with your little grief rituals and your obsession with Dad's memory, but this lottery thing is different. It's not healthy, and it's not fair to Noah to have to watch his grandmother throw money away on impossible dreams." Grief rituals. She'd reduced my weekly honoring of Thomas's memory to a pathological obsession that needed to be managed rather than respected. The numbers that represented our life together, our marriage, our daughter's birth, our grandson's arrival, had been transformed into evidence of mental instability rather than enduring love. Noah stood up abruptly, his young face pale with distress. "I don't want Grandma to be sick," he said, his voice breaking. "I don't want her to go away like Daddy did." The comparison hit me like a physical blow. In Noah's mind, my lottery tickets had somehow put me in the same category as his father, another adult who might disappear from his life without warning, leaving him with even less security than he'd started with. I looked at my grandson's tear-streaked face and realized that Lauren had succeeded in weaponizing his love for me against both of us. She'd turned my small act of hope into a threat to his emotional stability, my modest rebellion into evidence that I was just another unreliable adult who might abandon him. "Noah," I said gently, kneeling to his level despite the protest from my arthritic knees, "I'm not going anywhere. I love you more than anything in this world." "Then why do you buy those tickets?" he asked. and the question contained such genuine bewilderment that I felt my remaining defenses crumble completely. How could I explain to an 11-year-old that sometimes hope is the only thing standing between a person and complete despair? How could I make him understand that those numbers represented more than gambling? They were my way of insisting that love leaves permanent marks on the world, even when the people we love forget to notice. Because, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper, sometimes adults need to believe that tomorrow might be different from today. And sometimes that belief is all we have left. Lauren made a sound of disgust. That's exactly what I'm talking about. You're teaching him that it's okay to live in fantasy instead of dealing with reality. And what reality would you like me to deal with? I asked, standing slowly and facing my daughter with the accumulated weight of 3 years' worth of swallowed hurt. The reality that I gave up my home, my savings, my independence to help you, and you treat me like hired help? The reality that I raised you to be a strong, successful woman, and you use that strength to diminish the person who made it possible? For a moment, Lauren looked genuinely shocked, as if she'd never considered that her behavior might have been hurtful rather than merely practical. But the vulnerability lasted only seconds before her defenses reasserted themselves. I can't believe you're saying this in front of Noah, she said, her voice rising with righteous indignation. This is exactly what I mean about your attitude. Everything has to be about you, about your sacrifices, about what you've given up. Maybe if you spent less time feeling sorry for yourself and more time being grateful for what you have. Grateful? The word erupted from me with a force that surprised us both. You want me to be grateful for being treated like an unpaid servant in a house I helped save? Grateful for having my every choice questioned and criticized? Grateful for being made to feel like a burden instead of a beloved mother? Noah was sobbing now, overwhelmed by the adult emotions crashing around him like storm waves. I immediately knelt beside him again, pulling him into my arms despite Lauren's disapproving glare. I'm sorry, sweetheart, I whispered into his hair. Adults sometimes say things they don't mean when they're upset. None of this is your fault. But as I held my grandson and felt his small body shake with tears he was too young to understand, I realized that Lauren had achieved exactly what she'd intended. She'd positioned herself as the reasonable adult protecting her child from his unstable grandmother. She'd made my legitimate grievances sound like the complaints of an ungrateful woman who didn't appreciate the charity she'd been shown. And tomorrow night, when those lottery numbers were drawn, I would either be vindicated as someone worthy of hope or confirmed as the delusional old woman my daughter apparently believed me to be. But for the first time in 3 years, I found myself praying not for patience or strength, but for the courage to save myself, even if it meant disappointing the people I'd spent my whole life trying to please. Would Jesus forgive this too? I wondered silently, holding Noah close. Should I forgive again? The answer, when it came, felt like both a revelation and a relief. Yes, I could forgive, but forgiveness didn't require me to accept continued mistreatment. Even Jesus had overturned tables when necessary. Saturday morning arrived with the peculiar stillness that follows emotional storms, when everyone pretends that devastating words can be taken back and broken trust can be mended with careful politeness. Lauren had left early for her yoga class without saying goodbye, and Noah sat at the kitchen table picking at cereal while stealing worried glances at me, as if I might disappear at any moment like his father had. I moved through my morning routine mechanically. Coffee, prayer, the careful choreography of existing quietly in someone else's space. But something had shifted during the night. The woman who'd knelt beside her bed asking Jesus for patience had been replaced by someone who remembered that Christ himself had spoken harsh truths when gentle words proved insufficient. The lottery drawing was tonight. 24 years of the same numbers, representing a love story that Lauren had reduced to pathological behavior, and neighbors had transformed into evidence of mental decline. But sitting in the morning light with my Bible open to Ecclesiastes, I read words that felt like prophecy. To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under heaven. My season of silent suffering was ending. I could feel it in my bones like the approach of winter. Around noon, Noah found me in the garden behind Lauren's house, where I was tending the tomatoes I'd planted against her wishes. Too messy, she'd said. Too much work. But I'd planted them anyway, because Thomas had always said that a garden was proof that hope had physical consequences. Grandma? Noah's voice was small, tentative. Are you really sick like Mom says? I set down my watering can and knelt in the dirt beside him, not caring that my good pants would need washing. What do you think, sweetheart? Do I seem sick to you? He studied my face with the seriousness of someone much older than 11. You seem sad, but not sick, more like hurt sad, out of the mouths of babes. This child could see what his mother had chosen to ignore, that my so-called pathological behavior was actually the grief of someone who'd given everything and received contempt in return. Sometimes, I said carefully, adults make mistakes about what's wrong with other adults. Sometimes they see problems that aren't really problems. Like when Mom said I was being lazy in math, but really I just couldn't see the board from the back of the classroom. Exactly like that. I pulled him closer, breathing in the sweet scent of his hair that still carried traces of the baby shampoo I'd bought for him. Sometimes people need glasses for their hearts, not just their eyes. That evening, Lauren returned from her day out looking refreshed and righteous, as if a few hours of yoga and shopping had confirmed her assessment of our family's dysfunction. She found me in the living room, reading my Bible while dinner cooked in the slow cooker, a meal she'd already announced she wouldn't be eating because she had plans. Mom, we need to finish our conversation from last night, she said, settling into the chair across from me with the bearing of someone prepared to deliver difficult medicine. I've been thinking about what you said, and I think you might benefit from talking to someone professional. I marked my place in Psalms and closed the book gently. What kind of professional? A therapist, or maybe a grief counselor. Someone who specializes in helping older adults adjust to life changes. She spoke with the careful compassion of someone who'd rehearsed this speech, each word chosen to sound reasonable and caring, rather than controlling. And what life changes would those be? Lauren looked genuinely surprised by the question, as if the answer should be obvious. Dad's death, obviously. Moving in with us. Not having your own space anymore. I think you might be having trouble processing the adjustments. As if my grief over losing my independence, my home, my sense of self, was a psychological failing rather than the natural response to having my life dismantled piece by piece. I see, I said quietly. And what would this therapist help me process exactly? Well, the lottery thing, obviously. And maybe your expectations about family dynamics. I think you might have some unrealistic ideas about how things should work. Unrealistic ideas. Such as expecting gratitude for sacrificing everything, or hoping to be treated with basic respect rather than managed like a difficult pet. Such as believing that the woman who'd raised a daughter alone and supported her through every crisis deserved better than being pathologized for buying lottery tickets. And if I refuse this therapy? Lauren's mask of compassion slipped slightly. I'm not sure that's really an option, Mom. I mean, we all live here together. We need to find a way to make this work for everyone. Make this work for everyone. The coded language of ultimatums delivered with false kindness. Submit to being fixed, or find somewhere else to exist. I stood slowly, my arthritic knees protesting the movement, and walked to the kitchen where my purse sat on the counter. Inside, next to my rosary and the prayer book Thomas had given me, was the lottery ticket that represented everything Lauren wanted to pathologize about my character. The drawing was in 2 hours. At 9 o'clock, those numbers would either be chosen or passed over once again, and I would either be vindicated as someone worthy of hope or confirmed as the delusional old woman my daughter apparently believed me to be. But standing in her kitchen, surrounded by the accumulated weight of 3 years' worth of small humiliations and casual cruelties, I realized something that felt like divine revelation. It didn't matter whether I won or lost. What mattered was that I'd finally recognized the difference between loving someone and allowing them to destroy you in the name of that love. Lauren, I said, returning to the living room where she sat scrolling through her phone with the distracted attention of someone whose real life existed elsewhere. I want you to know that I forgive you. She looked up, startled. Forgive me for what? For forgetting that I'm your mother, not your employee. For treating my sacrifices like obligations rather than gifts. for making me feel like a burden instead of a blessing. My voice was steady, calm, filled with the peace that comes from finally speaking truth instead of swallowing it. Mom, I don't understand what? For reducing my grief to pathology and my hope to addiction. For making my grandson worry that his grandmother is sick because she dares to buy lottery tickets with her own money. I sat back down, meeting her eyes directly. I forgive all of it. Lauren's face cycled through confusion, defensiveness, and something that might have been guilt before settling on irritation. I think you're being overly dramatic. We're just trying to help you make better choices. No, I said gently. You're trying to control me because my independence makes you uncomfortable. But I want you to know that I understand why you're doing it, and I don't hate you for it. Before she could respond, I excused myself and went to my room. At 8:30, I knelt beside my bed with my rosary and prayed not for patience or strength, but for clarity, for the wisdom to know when suffering was purposeful and when it was simply destructive, for the courage to save myself, even if it meant disappointing people I loved. At 9 o'clock, I turned on the small television in my room and watched as the lottery numbers were drawn. First ball, 4, Noah's birthday. Second ball, 7, Lauren's birthday. Third ball, 18, my wedding anniversary. My hands began to shake. Fourth ball, 22, the day Thomas passed. Fifth ball, 31, Lauren's college graduation. Sixth ball, 42. The number of years Thomas and I were married. All of them. Every single number that represented the love story Lauren had dismissed as pathological grief. Every digit that honored the life she'd reduced to unhealthy obsession. I sat in stunned silence, staring at the television screen where my numbers glowed like stars against the dark background. $2 million. Not enough to buy back my house or undo the sacrifices I'd made, but enough to prove that hope wasn't always foolish. Enough to demonstrate that sometimes faith in impossible things is rewarded in impossible ways. I didn't scream or dance or cry with joy. Instead, I felt a profound sense of vindication that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with being seen. God had witnessed my faithful playing of these numbers for 24 years. He had remembered the love they represented when everyone else had forgotten. I called the lottery office from my cell phone, speaking in whispers to avoid waking Noah or alerting Lauren to this miraculous turn of events. Yes, I had the winning ticket. Yes, I could come in Monday morning to claim the prize. Yes, I understood the tax implications and the importance of getting legal advice. When I hung up, I knelt beside my bed again and whispered the first prayer of gratitude I'd offered in months. Thank you, Jesus, for remembering that Margaret Morrison was a woman worth saving. Thank you for proving that love leaves permanent marks on the world, even when the people we love forget to notice. Thank you for showing me that hope isn't pathological, it's prophetic. That night, I slept more deeply than I had in 3 years. Not because I was rich, but because I was free. Free to choose where I lived, how I spent my time, who I allowed to speak to me with respect or disrespect. Free to love my daughter and grandson without sacrificing my dignity in the process. And in the morning, when Lauren inevitably discovered what had happened, I would be ready to have the conversation we should have had months ago, not as a dependent seeking permission, but as a woman who'd finally remembered her own worth. The widow's mite had been returned 1,000-fold, but more importantly, the widow herself had been restored to wholeness. Jesus had indeed seen her when no one else did, and his vision had proven sufficient to change everything. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, and for the first time in 3 years, I woke without the familiar weight of dread pressing against my chest. The lottery ticket sat on my nightstand like a small miracle wrapped in paper, but the real transformation had nothing to do with money, and everything to do with remembering who I was before I allowed myself to be diminished. I dressed carefully for church, choosing the navy blue dress Thomas had always said brought out my eyes, and pinned his mother's pearl brooch to the collar. If today was going to be the day I reclaimed my life, I would do it looking like the woman I'd forgotten I could be. Lauren was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs, drinking coffee and scrolling through her phone with the distracted absorption that had become her permanent state. She looked up when I entered, and I saw surprise flicker across her face at my appearance. "You look nice, Mom," she said. and there was genuine confusion in her voice, as if she'd forgotten I was capable of existing as anything other than household help. "Are you going somewhere special?" "Mass at St. Anthony's," I replied, pouring myself coffee from the pot I'd made earlier. "Father Miguel gives beautiful homilies. Would you and Noah like to come with me?" The invitation hung in the air between us, weighted with 3 years of Sundays I'd attended alone while my daughter and grandson slept in or found other ways to fill the morning hours. Lauren shifted uncomfortably, caught between reflexive dismissal and something that might have been conscience. "We don't really do the church thing anymore," she said finally. "It's not that I'm against it. It's just not our lifestyle, not their lifestyle. As if faith were a hobby rather than a foundation, something to be discarded when it became inconvenient rather than embraced when life became difficult." I thought of Father Miguel's homily about the widow's mite, about how Jesus saw the sacrifices no one else bothered to notice, and felt a profound sadness for what my daughter had lost in her pursuit of independence from anything that might demand gratitude or humility. "I understand," I said gently, "but if either of you ever changes your mind, the invitation stands." Mass at St. Anthony's felt different that morning, charged with an electricity I couldn't quite name. Father Miguel's homily focused on the parable of the lost sheep, about how the Good Shepherd leaves the 99 to find the one who has wandered away. As he spoke about God's relentless pursuit of the forgotten and abandoned, I felt tears stream down my cheeks, not from sadness, but from recognition. I had been the lost sheep, wandering in a wilderness of unappreciation and emotional neglect, but God had found me, in the most unlikely way possible. Through numbers that represented love and loss and the persistence of hope, he had reminded me that I was worth pursuing. After Mass, I lingered in the empty church, lighting a candle for Thomas and whispering a prayer of gratitude that felt different from any I'd offered before. This wasn't the desperate pleading of a woman who felt abandoned by heaven, but the confident thanksgiving of someone who'd finally recognized divine intervention when it arrived. I returned home to find Lauren pacing the living room with her phone pressed to her ear, her voice tight with the controlled panic of someone whose carefully managed world had developed an unexpected crack. "I don't understand, Rebecca," she was saying. "She was weird at breakfast, all dressed up for church like she was going to a wedding or something. And then she asked us to come with her, which she hasn't done in months. It's like she's having some kind of episode." Episode. Even my moment of dignity had been pathologized, transformed into evidence of mental instability, rather than recognized as the natural result of a woman reclaiming her sense of self. Noah was sitting at the kitchen table, building something elaborate with Legos, while stealing worried glances toward the living room where his mother's anxiety filled the space like smoke. When he saw me, his face brightened with relief. "Grandma, you look really pretty. Did you have a good time at church?" "I did, sweetheart," I said, kissing the top of his head. "Father Miguel gave a wonderful sermon about sheep." "Sheep are cool," Noah said with the easy acceptance of a child who hadn't yet learned to be embarrassed by his grandmother's faith. "Did you know they can recognize up to 50 different faces?" "I didn't know that," I said, marveling at his sweet earnestness. "What else did you learn this week?" As Noah launched into an enthusiastic explanation of various animal facts he'd absorbed, Lauren ended her phone call and joined us in the kitchen. Her face bore the expression of someone who'd made a difficult decision and was prepared to execute it with maximum efficiency. "Mom, we need to talk," she announced. "Rebecca agrees that your behavior lately has been concerning. We think it would be best if you made an appointment with Dr. Patterson this week." Dr. Patterson, the family physician who'd known me for 15 years and had witnessed my devotion to Thomas during his final illness. The same Dr. Patterson who'd prescribed antidepressants after Thomas died and watched me gradually rebuild my life around service to others. Lauren apparently intended to weaponize my grief history against my current resistance to her control. "What exactly would I be discussing with Dr. Patterson?" I asked calmly. "Your mental state. This fixation on lottery tickets. The way you've been acting defensive about everything. The sudden religiosity." Lauren ticked off my alleged symptoms like items on a grocery list. "We're worried about you, Mom. People your age sometimes develop dementia or depression, and it's important to catch these things early." Sudden religiosity. As if the faith that had sustained me through 45 years of marriage, single motherhood, and recent heartbreak was a new development worthy of medical concern. As if the woman who'd attended Mass regularly since childhood had suddenly become dangerously devout. Noah had stopped building and was watching our conversation with the wide-eyed alertness of a child who'd learned to monitor adult tensions for signs of his world shifting beneath his feet. "Lauren," I said quietly, "I'd like to speak with you privately." She followed me to my room, where I closed the door and turned to face my daughter. Really face her, for the first time in months. In the afternoon light streaming through my small window, I could see Thomas's features in her face, the stubborn chin and intelligent eyes that had made me fall in love with him decades ago. But I could also see the hardness that came from years of fighting for professional respect and emotional independence. Armor that had served her well in the corporate world, but had somehow transformed her mother into just another obstacle to be managed. "Before we discuss my mental health," I said, reaching into my purse for the lottery ticket that had become my declaration of independence, "I have something to show you." I handed her the ticket, along with the confirmation email I'd printed at the church library before coming home. Lauren stared at the papers for a long moment, her eyes moving back and forth between the numbers and the official lottery website confirmation, as if she were trying to translate text written in a foreign language. "Is this some kind of joke?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "No joke," I said. "Your pathetic, mentally unstable mother just won $2 million. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the heating system cycling on and the distant sound of Noah's Legos clicking together in the kitchen. Lauren sank onto my bed, still clutching the papers, her face cycling through disbelief, shock, and something that looked dangerously close to calculation. $2 million, she repeated, as if saying the words aloud might make them more comprehensible. "After taxes, probably about 1.2 million, I said with the calm precision of someone who'd done the research. "Enough to buy a small house, certainly. Enough to live independently. Enough to prove that hope isn't always foolish." Lauren's eyes snapped up to meet mine, and I saw the exact moment when shock transformed into something else. A desperate scrambling for control over a situation that had suddenly shifted beyond her management. "Mom, this is incredible," she said, and her voice carried forced enthusiasm that sounded like glass breaking. "We can pay off the house completely. Maybe even look into getting a bigger place, somewhere with more room for all of us. All of us." She'd moved from questioning my sanity to planning our shared future in the space of 30 seconds, as if my lottery win was naturally her windfall rather than the vindication of choices she'd spent weeks pathologizing. "Actually," I said gently, "I've been thinking about getting my own place again." The words landed like physical blows, and I watched Lauren's face crumple with something that might have been genuine panic. "Your own place? But why? We're family. We're supposed to stick together, especially now that you have the resources to really contribute to our household." Contribute to our household. Even in the face of my financial independence, she couldn't imagine a scenario where I existed for my own purposes rather than in service to hers. "Lauren," I said, sitting beside her on the bed where I'd knelt in prayer for 3 years, asking God to help me be patient with my ungrateful daughter. "Do you remember the last time you said thank you to me? Not for something specific, but just, thank you for being here, for helping, for caring." She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, her face flushing with the embarrassment of someone who'd been caught in an unconscious cruelty. "I say thank you," she said weakly. "You tell me what errands to run and what meals to cook, and how my cooking smells bother the neighbors," I replied. "You discuss my mental health with your sister and threaten me with therapy when I don't conform to your expectations. You use my grandson as a weapon to make me feel guilty for buying lottery tickets with my own money." Each word was delivered with the calm precision of someone who'd finally decided to speak truth instead of swallowing it. Not with anger, but with the peaceful certainty of someone who'd remembered her own worth. "But I want you to know," I continued, "that I forgive you for all of it. I forgive you for forgetting that I'm your mother, not your employee. I forgive you for treating my sacrifices like obligations, and I forgive you for making me feel like a burden instead of a blessing." Lauren was crying now, real tears that seemed to surprise her with their intensity. "I don't understand what's happening," she whispered. "I thought we were a family. I thought we were helping each other." "We are family," I said, taking her hand. "We always will be. But love doesn't require me to accept disrespect. Faith doesn't demand that I sacrifice my dignity to prove my devotion." I stood and walked to my dresser, pulling out the small suitcase I'd hidden there weeks ago. Not because I'd been planning to leave, but because some part of me had known this moment was coming. "I've already made an appointment to look at a small house near the lake," I said. 2 bedrooms, one for me, and one for when Noah wants to visit his grandmother who remembers how to say no. Lauren stood abruptly, panic replacing tears. "You can't just leave. What about Noah? What about me? I need you here." The admission hung in the air between us, honest and desperate and 3 years too late. "You need a housekeeper," I said gently. "You need a babysitter. You need someone to blame when life doesn't meet your expectations. But you don't need me. Margaret Morrison, your mother, a woman with her own thoughts and feelings and rights." "I never meant to make you feel that way," she said. And for the first time in months, I heard my daughter's real voice beneath the controlling adult she'd become. "I know," I said, "but intent doesn't erase impact. And I can't save you from learning that lesson any more than I can save myself by continuing to absorb the consequences of it." I zipped up my suitcase and turned to face her one more time. "I forgive you, Lauren, but I won't enable you anymore. Sometimes the most loving thing a mother can do is let her child learn to stand on their own feet, even when they don't want to." As I walked toward the door, my daughter's voice stopped me. "What am I supposed to tell Noah?" I turned back and smiled, the first genuinely peaceful expression I'd worn in her presence for months. "Tell him his grandmother loves him enough to show him what it looks like when someone values themselves. Tell him that respect is earned, not inherited. And tell him that his room will always be ready whenever he wants to visit a house where kindness isn't confused with weakness." The look on Lauren's face as I left that room would haunt me for weeks. Not with guilt, but with the profound sadness of watching someone realize too late what they'd been taking for granted. But as I walked downstairs to say goodbye to Noah, I felt lighter than I had in years. The woman who'd spent 3 years apologizing for taking up space was gone, replaced by someone who remembered that even Jesus had overturned tables when gentle words proved insufficient. Grace didn't require me to be a doormat. Faith didn't demand that I enable cruelty in the name of family loyalty. And sometimes, the most Christ-like thing you can do is save yourself. 3 weeks later, I stood on the front porch of my new home, watching the sunrise paint the lake in shades of gold and amber that reminded me of the stained glass windows at St. Mary's Cathedral, where Thomas and I had been married 45 years ago. The house was smaller than the one I'd sold to save Lauren's mortgage, but it was mine. Every creaking board, every window that caught the morning light, every room that existed for my comfort rather than someone else's convenience. The realtor had called it a cozy cottage, which I'd learned was code for too small for most families. But for a 73-year-old woman who'd forgotten what it felt like to matter, it was perfect. 2 bedrooms, as I'd promised. One for me and one for Noah, when he decided he was ready to visit his grandmother who'd learned to say no. A kitchen where I could cook what I wanted without worrying about offending anyone with the scent of garlic and onions. A living room where my Bible could sit open on the coffee table without anyone rolling their eyes at my sudden religiosity. My first act in the new house had been to hang Thomas's photograph above the mantelpiece, not hidden away like a shameful secret, but displayed with the pride of a woman who'd been truly loved and wanted to remember what that felt like. Beside it, I'd placed the small wooden cross Noah had made for me in Sunday school 3 years ago, back when Lauren still allowed him to attend church with his grandmother. The second act had been to call Father Miguel and ask about volunteering opportunities at St. Anthony's. "Mrs. Morrison," he'd said, and I could hear the smile in his voice, "we've been praying for someone exactly like you." Now, every Tuesday and Thursday, I helped serve lunch at the church's soup kitchen, ladling food into bowls held by hands that shook with age, addiction, or desperation. These people understood what it meant to be discarded by a world that measured worth in productivity and convenience. They said, "Thank you," like they meant it, looked me in the eyes when I spoke to them, treated my small acts of service like gifts rather than obligations. Mrs. Morrison, said Helen, a woman about my age who'd been living in her car since her son moved to Florida and stopped returning her calls. That cornbread you made yesterday was just like my mama used to make. Haven't tasted anything that good in years. I squeezed her weathered hand, recognizing in her eyes the same invisible pain I'd carried for months. There's more where that came from, dear. And Helen? You don't have to call me Mrs. Morrison. My friends call me Margaret. The word friends felt foreign on my tongue at first, like speaking a language I'd forgotten how to use. But slowly, week by week, I was building a community of people who valued my presence rather than my productivity. People who understood that dignity wasn't something you earned through usefulness, but something you carried simply by being human. On Sundays, I attended the 10 a.m. Mass at St. Anthony's, sitting in the third pew on the left where the morning light streamed through the windows depicting the Sermon on the Mount. After service, a small group of us would gather for coffee and discussion in the parish hall. Martha, whose husband had passed 5 years ago. Frank, a retired teacher who spent his days reading to children at the library. Sarah, a nurse who worked night shifts at the hospital and found solace in morning prayers. You know what I love about this group? Martha said one Sunday, stirring cream into her coffee while autumn light danced through the windows. We're all old enough to have stopped pretending that life is supposed to be easy, but young enough in spirit to believe it can still be meaningful. Young enough in spirit. I'd forgotten I could be described that way, forgotten that age was something that happened to your body, not necessarily to your capacity for joy or growth or surprise. The lottery money sat mostly untouched in a savings account that earned modest interest and gave me the profound luxury of not worrying about every dollar spent. I'd bought the house outright, furnished it simply but comfortably, and set aside enough for Noah's college education, money that would be available when he turned 18. Regardless of his mother's opinion about his grandmother's mental state. But the real wealth wasn't in the bank account. It was in the silence of mornings when I could pray, without wondering if someone was listening to judge the length or fervor of my devotions. It was in the freedom to cook meals that pleased me, rather than someone else's palate. It was in the simple pleasure of reading my Bible in the living room without hiding it like contraband. One Thursday evening, while I was preparing vegetables for the next day's soup kitchen meal, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Noah's number, and my heart clenched with the familiar mixture of love and worry that accompanied any contact with my grandson. Grandma? His voice was small, careful, like someone testing the safety of thin ice. Hello, sweetheart. How are you? I'm okay. Mom said I could call you if I wanted to. She said you have your own house now. I set down my knife and gave him my complete attention. I do. It's a little house by the lake, with a room that's waiting for you whenever you'd like to visit. Would you really want me to visit? The question was so hesitant, so weighted with a child's fear of being unwanted, that I had to grip the counter to steady myself. Noah Morrison, I said firmly, you are my grandson, and I love you more than all the stars in the sky. There is nothing you could do, nothing anyone could say, that would ever make me not want to spend time with you. I heard him take a shaky breath. Mom's been really sad since you left. She cries sometimes when she thinks I'm not looking, and she's been trying to cook dinner, but she's not very good at it. The image of Lauren struggling with basic household tasks she'd taken for granted for 3 years should have given me satisfaction. But instead, I felt the familiar ache of a mother watching her child suffer, even when that suffering was the natural consequence of their own choices. Learning to take care of yourself is hard, I said carefully. But your mother is strong and smart. She'll figure it out. Could you maybe come back? He asked, and the hope in his voice nearly broke my heart. Just for dinner sometimes? I miss your pot roast. And I miss how you make everything feel safe. I closed my eyes and prayed for wisdom, for the right words to explain to an 11-year-old why love sometimes requires distance, why enabling someone's selfishness isn't the same as helping them grow. Noah, do you remember when you were learning to ride your bicycle and I had to let go of the seat even though you were scared? Yeah, I let go because holding on forever wouldn't have helped you learn to balance on your own. Sometimes people we love need to experience a little wobbling before they can find their stability. He was quiet for a long moment. Is Mom wobbling? A little. But she's strong, and she's smart, and learning to wobble is how we get stronger. Can I come visit you this weekend? He asked suddenly. I want to see your new house, and I want to hear about the soup kitchen. Mom said you're feeding homeless people now. I'm feeding people who need food, I corrected gently. And yes, sweetheart, you can absolutely visit this weekend. I'll make your favorite chocolate chip pancakes for breakfast. The joy in his voice when he said goodbye was like sunshine after months of rain. Friday evening, Lauren's car pulled into my driveway for the first time since I'd moved out. I watched from my kitchen window as she helped Noah with his overnight bag, her movements careful and deliberate, like someone walking through a minefield of potential emotional explosions. When they reached the front door, I opened it before they could knock, and the sight of my grandson's face, bright with excitement and curiosity, reminded me why grace sometimes requires courage rather than compliance. Wow, Grandma, your house is perfect, Noah said, spinning around in my small living room like he was cataloging every detail for future memory. It smells like cinnamon and feels like hugs. Lauren stood in the doorway, taking in the space I'd created for myself, the comfortable furniture, the plants thriving in sunny windows, the photographs of family displayed with love rather than obligation. Her eyes lingered on Thomas's portrait and the small prayer corner I'd created near the window, complete with my Bible, rosary, and a small statue of St. Joseph that had belonged to my mother. It's very you, she said finally, and there was something in her voice that might have been wistfulness. Thank you, I said simply. Would you like some coffee before you go? She shook her head, but didn't move toward the door. Mom, I wanted to apologize for how I treated you, for not seeing. She trailed off, looking around my peaceful space with eyes that seemed to be calculating what she'd lost rather than celebrating what I'd gained. You don't need to apologize, I said gently. You need to learn. And learning happens best when people experience the natural consequences of their choices. I'm trying, she said. And for the first time in years, she sounded like the young woman who'd once called me her best friend. It's harder than I thought it would be. Everything you did. I never realized how much work it was. That's because you weren't paying attention, I said without malice. But attention is a skill that can be developed, just like any other. She hugged Noah goodbye and drove away, leaving me alone with my grandson for the first time in months. We spent the evening building a puzzle at my kitchen table while pot roast simmered in the slow cooker, filling the house with the kind of domestic comfort I'd forgotten I was capable of creating. Grandma, Noah said as we fitted together pieces of a lighthouse scene, are you happier now? The question was so direct, so innocent in its assumption that adult emotions could be measured and understood, that I had to pause before answering. Yes, sweetheart. I'm much happier. Because you won the lottery? Because I remembered that I'm valuable even when people forget to appreciate me. Because I learned that God sees me even when I feel invisible. Because I discovered that loving someone doesn't mean letting them treat me badly. He nodded with the seriousness of someone filing away important information for future reference. I want to be like you when I'm old, he said, brave enough to choose happiness even when it's scary. That night, after Noah had fallen asleep in his room, the room I'd decorated with his favorite books and a nightlight that projected stars on the ceiling, I sat on my porch with a cup of tea and watched the moon reflect off the lake like a silver prayer. For the first time in years, I felt complete. Not because someone needed me, but because I'd finally remembered how to need myself. Not because I was useful to others, but because I was valuable to God. Thank you, Jesus, I whispered into the night air, for showing me that sometimes the greatest miracle isn't getting what we want, but discovering we're strong enough to choose what we deserve. The lottery win had given me financial independence, but faith had given me something far more precious, the knowledge that I was loved by the Creator of the universe, and that love was sufficient to sustain me whether anyone else noticed or not. 6 months after I moved into my cottage by the lake, I received an unexpected visitor on a crisp February morning when the winter sun turned the frozen water into a field of diamonds. I was sitting in my kitchen, reading the morning devotion from Jesus Calling while my coffee cooled, when I heard a car door slam in my driveway. Through the window, I watched Lauren emerge from her vehicle, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who'd rehearsed this moment many times in her mind. She carried a manila envelope and wore the expression of someone preparing to have a difficult conversation they could no longer avoid. I opened the door before she knocked, and what I saw in her face surprised me. The defensive anger I'd grown accustomed to had been replaced by something I hadn't seen in years. Genuine humility, mixed with what looked suspiciously like hope. "Hello, Mom," she said, and her voice carried none of the forced casualness that had characterized our interactions for so long. "Could we talk?" I invited her in and made fresh coffee, giving us both time to settle into the strange new dynamic of two adults who were learning to relate as equals rather than victim and persecutor. She sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Noah and I had built puzzles and shared chocolate chip pancakes, and studied the space I'd created with the wonder of someone seeing her mother as a complete person for the first time. "Your house feels like peace," she said finally. "I never realized how tense our old situation was until I walked in here and felt calm." I poured coffee into mugs that matched, a small luxury I'd forgotten to appreciate during the years when everything in my life was borrowed or temporary. "What brings you by today, sweetheart?" She opened the manila envelope and pulled out a stack of papers that looked official and important. "I wanted to show you something, and to say some things I should have said months ago." The papers, I discovered, were enrollment documents for a family therapy program at the hospital where she worked. Not therapy for me, as she'd threatened before, but therapy for herself. Sessions focused on recognizing patterns of emotional neglect and learning to rebuild relationships damaged by taking loved ones for granted. "I've been going for 8 weeks," she said, her fingers tracing the edge of the papers. "The therapist asked me to write a letter to the most important person I'd hurt through my behavior. Would you let me read it to you?" I nodded, settling back in my chair with the patience I'd learned during months of morning prayers and soup kitchen conversations with people who understood what it meant to wait for grace. Lauren unfolded a handwritten letter, her handwriting shaky with emotion I'd rarely seen her display. She took a deep breath and began to read. "Dear Mom," she started, and her voice immediately cracked. "I'm writing this letter because my therapist says I need to face the truth about how I treated you, and I need to say it out loud to the person I hurt most. For 3 years, I turned you into my employee instead of treating you like my mother. I took your sacrifices for granted and made you feel guilty for having needs or wants of your own. I criticized your faith, pathologized your hope, and made you feel like a burden when you were actually the blessing that held our family together. I told myself I was helping you by giving you purpose, but the truth is, I was using you because it was convenient. I convinced myself that you owed me your service because I was providing you shelter, but I was the one who owed you everything: gratitude, respect, love, and recognition for the woman who sacrificed her entire retirement to save my house and raise my son when his father abandoned us. I called your lottery tickets pathological, but they weren't about gambling. They were about holding on to hope when I was systematically destroying your reasons to hope. They were about honoring Dad's memory when I was too busy to remember that you were still grieving the love of your life. They were about believing in possibility when I was making you feel impossible. I used Noah as a weapon against you, making you feel guilty for buying tickets by suggesting your behavior was harming him. But the truth is, Noah was learning more about love and sacrifice from watching you than he ever learned from watching me manage you like a problem to be solved. I am sorry, Mom. Not because you won the lottery and proved me wrong about everything, but because I forgot that you're a human being who deserves to be treated with dignity. I'm sorry because I took the woman who taught me how to be strong and tried to make her feel weak. I'm sorry because I had a mother who loved me unconditionally, and I responded by placing conditions on my love for her. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect you to come back and make my life easier. I just wanted you to know that I finally see what I did, and I'm working every day to become the daughter you deserve to have all along. By the time she finished reading, we were both crying, not the bitter tears of accumulated resentment, but the cleansing tears of truth finally spoken and received. Oh, Lauren, I said, reaching across the table to take her hand. I forgave you months ago. The question was never whether I could forgive you. It was whether you could learn to forgive yourself and do better. She squeezed my fingers like a lifeline. I want to do better. I want Noah to grow up knowing how to appreciate the people who love him instead of taking them for granted. I want to be someone you can be proud of again. I was always proud of you, I said gently. Even when I was hurt by your choices, I was proud of your strength and intelligence and determination. I just wanted you to use those gifts to build people up instead of tearing them down. We talked for 2 hours, sharing coffee and honesty in equal measure. Lauren told me about the parenting classes she'd enrolled in, the efforts she was making to create family traditions that honored the people who'd sacrificed for their well-being. She described Noah's improved grades and emotional stability, how he'd started talking about his grandmother with pride instead of worry. "He wants to volunteer at the soup kitchen with you when he's old enough," she said with a smile that reminded me of the young woman who'd once believed she could change the world. "He says he wants to learn how to make people feel seen the way you make him feel seen." When she prepared to leave, Lauren paused at my door and looked back at the life I'd built for myself, the plants thriving in sunny windows, the Bible open on the coffee table, the photographs displayed with love rather than obligation. "I always thought I was successful because I was independent," she said. "But you're successful because you're free. There's a difference I never understood before." After she left, I sat on my porch swing, the one I'd bought to replace the one Thomas had built in our old backyard, and reflected on the journey that had brought me from invisible victim to visible victor. The lottery win had been a miracle, but the real transformation had happened in my heart, where I'd finally learned the difference between sacrificial love and self-destructive enabling. That evening at St. Anthony's Soup Kitchen, I ladled chili into bowls held by hands that shook with age, illness, and desperation, and I listened to stories that reminded me how quickly anyone's life could shift from stable to precarious. But I also witnessed something beautiful in that church basement, people who'd lost everything except their humanity, treating each other with the kind of respect and gratitude that my own family had forgotten to offer. "Mrs. Margaret," said James, a veteran whose disability check didn't stretch far enough to cover both rent and food. "That cornbread you made yesterday reminded me of Sunday dinners at my grandmother's house. Made me feel like I was still somebody's precious grandchild, you know?" I squeezed his shoulder and smiled. "You are somebody's precious child, James. God's child. And that makes you precious indeed." On my way home, I stopped at Murphy's Corner Store, where Mr. Murphy greeted me with the familiar warmth of someone who'd witnessed both my lowest moments and my greatest triumph. "Evening, Mrs. Morrison. How are things at the lake house?" "Blessed beyond measure," I said, and meant it completely. "Mr. Murphy, can I ask you something? Did you ever think I'd actually win?" He chuckled, his eyes twinkling with gentle mischief. "Mrs. Morrison, I've been selling lottery tickets for 23 years. I've seen people win money and lose their souls, and I've seen people lose money but find their purpose. You're the first person I've ever met who won the lottery and discovered she was worth more than the prize." His words followed me home, where I sat in my reading chair with my Bible open to Romans 8:28. "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. All things, even the heartbreak of being taken for granted, even the humiliation of being pathologized for holding on to hope, even the loneliness of loving people who forgot to love back. God had worked all of it together for good. Not just the lottery win, but the spiritual strength I'd developed while learning to value myself as much as I valued others." Noah called later that evening, full of excitement about a school project on community service, and eager to hear stories about the soup kitchen volunteers who'd become my dearest friends. "Grandma," he said as our conversation was winding down, "I told my teacher about how you won the lottery and she said that was amazing. But I told her the really amazing thing was how you learned to be happy even before you won." Out of the mouths of babes, my 11-year-old grandson had grasped what it had taken me 73 years to understand. Happiness isn't something that happens to you when your circumstances improve. It's something you choose when you finally recognize your own worth. As I prepared for bed that night, I knelt beside my bed as I had every night for decades. But my prayer was different from the desperate pleas I'd whispered during my darkest months with Lauren. "Thank you, Jesus," I said aloud, "for loving me enough to let me fall apart so I could learn to put myself back together. Thank you for showing me that hope isn't pathological, it's prophetic. Thank you for proving that sometimes the greatest miracle isn't getting what we want, but discovering we're strong enough to demand what we deserve. I climbed into bed between sheets that smelled like the lavender fabric softener I preferred, in a room that existed solely for my comfort, in a house that reflected my choices rather than someone else's expectations. For the first time in 3 years, I fell asleep without worrying about whether I'd said the right thing, done enough, or somehow failed to earn my right to exist. The lottery had given me money, but faith had given me something far more valuable. The unshakable knowledge that I was loved by the Creator of the universe, and that love was sufficient to sustain me whether anyone else remembered to notice or not. Sometimes God answers the prayers we whisper through tears, but sometimes, if we're very blessed, He answers the prayers we gave up whispering long ago, the ones we'd stopped believing He could hear. And that is the miracle that transforms lives from the inside out, one act of self-respect at a time. Now let me ask you something, dear friend who's listened to my story. Have you ever felt invisible in your own family? Have you ever sacrificed so much for the people you love that you forgot you were worth loving too? How did your faith help you remember your own value when others forgot to see it? Tell me in the comments below. I'd love to hear how God has worked miracles in your life, big or small. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe to this channel so this message can reach someone else who needs to remember they're precious in God's eyes. Because somewhere out there, another Margaret Morrison is learning to choose herself without guilt, and she needs to know she's not alone in that journey. May God bless everyone who's ever felt forgotten, taken for granted, or invisible. You are seen. You are valued. You are loved beyond measure. In Jesus' name, amen.